All right, Alexander, let's do a recap of the video summit between US President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. And, I don't think anything happened that was unexpected during during the phone call. No surprises, to be quite honest. We do have the statements that have come out of the White House. Mostly Jake Sullivan was the one that gave the statements to reporters, and then we have the Kremlin readout as well, which is the Kremlin readout. The Kremlin readout is more detailed, as is usually the case. Sullivan said some pretty dumb stuff, especially about Nord Stream, and the fact that the Russians don't have the leverage when it comes to energy. We do. We have the leverage. It really bizarre comment. It shows just how out of his depth he is. But there was a little gaffe in the beginning with Biden's microphone. He forgot to unmute himself. The interesting part was that this was supposed to be, it was supposed to be a one-on-one private conversation, and Vladimir Putin he was alone. He said his translator was in the other room. And and Biden had a bunch of people. He had Sullivan and Blinken and the translator and some NSC guy. Really, really bizarre. But I guess, okay, this is Biden, so I guess you gotta have people around him to help him out. Anyway, what do you make? What are your impressions of the call, of the content of the call that we know of? Because obviously we only know as much as he gives.
Absolutely, we have quite a lot actually that's coming out, because you're absolutely right. There was no discussion at all. Putin, as you said, was there by himself. He was told it was going to be a one-to-one meeting, so he turned up. He was there as always in full command of his facts. He even sent the translator into the other room. Remember, Putin speaks English. It's a fact not widely known, but he does know English. He can understand English, and one always knows that his team, Putin's team, are there in the background, and they'll be listening to the recording, and they'll be taking a very accurate record of what's happened. But the fact is Putin who conducts the conversation. He's able to speak by himself directly to Biden. On the other hand, you have Biden, the President of the United States, and they apparently won't let the president speak one-to-one with the Russian leader. There has to be the entire bureaucracy there with him in the room. That changes somewhat one's conception of what a one-to-one meeting is. But I have to say that the pictures really are extraordinarily revealing in themselves. Now, the discussion. There was no discussion. There was no actual discussion. It wasn't a conversation between two men. What it was Biden reading out what are essentially pre-prepared texts. The reason the bureaucracy was there was to make sure that he didn't stray from the wording of those texts. That was absolutely clear to me. Putin was able to respond to the various comments that were said, but essentially Biden was working from a script. So that already limits the nature of the discussion itself. Now, the summit meeting itself is not important. Nothing very much happened. There was no real change. There isn't, as I said, going to be a war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is in no condition, it turns out, to launch an offensive. It might have been at the start of this year when Zelensky deployed it to the contact line, but it's remained there ever since, and it's gradually falling apart. The Russian military is in a position to launch an offensive, but they've repeatedly said that they're only going to do that if their red lines are crossed, and if there is a counter-offensive, if there is a Ukrainian offensive, and then they will launch a counter-offensive. So given that there isn't going to be a Ukrainian offensive, given that the red lines are not going to be crossed this winter, there isn't going to be a war this winter. So this is a manufactured crisis. And it's also been, in effect, a high-stakes poker game. And playing poker with the Russians is never a particularly good idea, because what they've done, in effect, is that they managed to win some tricks. And, I don't want to suggest they won the game. They haven't. But they won a couple of tricks. Firstly, they've got the US to accept that if there is a war in Ukraine, the United States will not defend Ukraine. Lloyd Austin, who's the defense secretary, actually said that explicitly. There is not going to be US military intervention to defend Ukraine. So the Russians have now got that accepted. That implicitly accepts their red lines, because it means that Ukraine cannot join NATO, because the Russians have said that that is a red line and they will take forceful military action against Ukraine if that happens. That means that there won't be missiles in Ukraine, because again, the Russians have said they would take forceful military action if that happens too. And it means that it's less likely, it seems to me, that there will be an attack on the Donbass. Now, the United States has come up with all kinds of flesh-creeping talk about sanctions, about cutting Russia off from the world financial system, all those sort of things. As we've discussed in previous programs, we've now reached that point when those sanctions are going to do more damage to the European economy than they are going to do to the Russians. And that gives the Europeans an incentive, if you like, to prevent a war. So, given that we've now reached that position where the United States has implicitly, I want to stress implicitly, accepted Russia's red lines with respect to Ukraine, and given that there is now a European incentive to not have a war in Ukraine, which would trigger sanctions, which would hurt the European economy very badly, you can see that the incentive has now grown to actually hold talks about reforming Europe's security architecture. Now, I've done a program for my channel in which I point out that even parts of the British media are accepting that that is the case, and we've had from the readouts confirmation that there will be preliminary talks about all of this. No one should see this as the end of the process. It's going to be a massive task trying to get anybody in Washington or Brussels to accept serious reforms to the European security architecture, or even a formal end to NATO's eastward expansion. But for the first time, as a result of this artificially confected crisis, that topic is on the diplomatic agenda, and the United States has been pushed into a position where as it's implicitly accepted the Russian red lines, it's agreeing to hold talks on this topic. So it's not the end of the game, it's not a resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, but it is, if you like, the Russians winning some tricks in a poker game.
No, Putin said that the only way out of the Ukrainian mess is the Minsk agreements, which I completely agree with. That's right. The way out. For Ukraine, at least, it's the best solution they have on the table, which they do not adhere to.
Absolutely.
Ukraine doesn't adhere to it. No. The Europeans don't push Ukraine to adhere to it. And the United States just thumbs its nose at it. But that is the way out for Ukraine. What are the risks that a conflict does happen now after this phone call, Alexander? Are there still risks? For me, you have two very big risks. The vacuum in D.C., the Biden vacuum in the executive, and the crumbling state of Ukraine and Zelensky. I mean, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that you pretty much are heading towards a vacuum in the Ukraine presidency as well. I mean, Zelensky is turning out to be just a no-show, a lame duck at this moment in time, and that worries me.
Well, can I just say straight away, I mean, the prospects of a war remain extremely high. I don't think this summit meeting has diminished them at all. And in fact, you can even argue that because the Russians have won some tricks, and I want to stress, tricks, they haven't won the game, because they're actually gaining some ground. that in some ways increases the danger of war. Now, let's just take a step back and let's just talk about the Minsk agreement very quickly. If you take the whole issue of Ukraine joining NATO off the agenda, if you implicitly accept Russian red lines on this topic, then Ukraine ceases to have any value at all. It doesn't have much value anyway, but it has no value at all. And at that point, maybe your best solution is to resolve the crisis in Ukraine. And that might be the best way to do it is by going back to the Minsk agreement. Now, can I just say that's not something Western governments up to now have been prepared to do. I don't think intellectually they're ready for it. We're still a long way from getting to that point, but perhaps we are one step closer, just one small step closer to that realization that those talks between Ukrainians, what Putin was very careful in his talks with Biden to make clear was an internal Ukrainian conflict. Those internal Ukrainian talks, maybe we're just a little step closer to making it to a situation where the Europeans start to say, well, maybe this is the way out of this problem that we have created for ourselves. Don't want to put too much on that. But the biggest problem is you have all of these people. You have people in Ukraine. You have people in Washington. You have people in Brussels. You have people in London. You also have some people in Berlin. They do not want a situation where there is a reform to Europe's security architecture. They do not want a situation where, in effect, NATO's expansion has ended. The reason they don't want those things is because they are intent on pursuing a Cold War against Russia. Their ultimate objective is to destabilize Russia and to return to the situation there which existed in the 1990s, where the country was in effect a satellite of the United States and was a piece, if you like, in the great game. And there are some of them who want to go further still. They'd even like to see the country break up, just as the Soviet Union did. So those people sense that they've lost a trick in the game. And they're going to be looking for ways to try to retrieve that. And inevitably, what they're going to do, in light of the weakening power vacuum in Washington, where the president is unable to speak without having lots of people around him, he's not even trusted to read out a script without having his handlers there. So in that kind of situation, they're going to push for a renewed confrontation, and they're going to team up with the hardliners in Ukraine, who also are becoming increasingly alarmed at the way their particular project is now essentially failing. And you can very easily see how they will all try to go for broke, and that could lead to a war. So, as I said, the fact that they're losing now implicitly makes it more likely that they could increase the tensions which could lead to a war might increase in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think we're right about, I think we've called this spot on because we're right about how the neocons are pushing for this. For example, we have reports that Victoria Nuland, right after the phone call, was hitting hard again at getting Russia off SWIFT. She actually went and she spoke with the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland explored possible ways that Washington could punish Moscow for any military incursion. Quote, "What we are talking about would amount to essentially isolating Russia completely from the global financial system, with all the fallout that would entail for Russian businesses, for the Russian people, for their ability to work and travel and trade." I'm not done. That's a direct quote, Alexander, from Victoria Nuland.
I know, absolutely. I mean,
this is not about adversaries. I was just going to say it's not about geopolitical adversaries. This is about a person's absolute hatred for Russia and Russian people. This is someone that wants to damage, that wants to destroy Russian people. This is dangerous. And real quick, before you respond to this, real quick, there was also, I don't know if you saw the interview on Fox News, Neil Cavuto's show, where he had Senator Wicker from Mississippi. Senator Wicker said, and I'm going to paraphrase it after the phone call, that the U.S. should deploy troops to Ukraine, that the U.S. should move warships into the Black Sea, and I think I'm going to get this quote correct, should rain down destruction on Russia, and that nuclear missiles are definitely on the table in order to destroy Russia. This is a senator, a Republican senator from Mississippi.
Yeah.
This is all about destroying Russia, and in some cases, in Victoria Nuland's case, this is like a deep-seated hatred for the Russian people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
my opinion.
Well, I don't think it's your opinion. Actually, I think it's a fact. I mean, how else do you interpret these things? Punishing the Russian people in that kind of a way. Now, I mean, I think a point really immediately must be made here. Talking about cutting off Russia from the global financial system, it is a nonsense. You can cut Russia off from SWIFT, but you can't stop Russians traveling abroad. All that would do is that it would accelerate the breakup of the financial system itself. Russia, as I said, has an alternative to SWIFT. Putin went to India. The Indians explicitly said to Putin, well, let's team up, we'll accept your card, your Mir card in India, and in return you accept our payment systems, our Indian payment systems in Russia. Russians have similar connections now with China. Iran, which has been the subject of exactly the kind of sanctions that Nuland is talking about, well, its economy has been very badly messed about, but I've always argued that has more to do with domestic mismanagement than the sanctions. And in fact, in this kind of situation, it's actually now moving towards closer connections with Russia and China. So what Nuland is saying, which is, I agree, obsessive and visceral in its dislike of the country and its people, what its end result would be the breakup of the world financial system, and in the short term, real damage to the European economies, and even to some extent to the US economy. And that is where an obsession leads you. It leads you into situations where you start to do things which are contrary to your own interests. Now, the question is the political system in Washington strong enough to contain people like that, people who have this ultimately self-destructive urge where they're prepared to bring down the temple in order to hurt the adversary? And you talk about Nuland, I mean, this crazy senator who talks about World War III, because what he's talking about, that's what it amounts to. I mean, are you prepared? Are there people in the United States who are prepared to restrain these people, to bring sense, to bring some rationality to this discussion? And I think that is a massive question. I don't, unfortunately, have a simple answer to that. The fact is, Nuland is a high official in the US government. She's repeatedly reappointed to senior positions in the State Department by successive American administrations, Democrat administrations. And you have senators, a person in the Senate, the United States Senate. I believe that particular senator is actually on the Armed Services Committee, who is talking glibly about starting nuclear war. Now, when you're dealing with people who are as irrational in their hatred of a country as that, well, you have to be very worried. And I think we all should be. And that's putting it mildly.
Yeah. I agree with you there. Let's get to another incompetent in the Biden administration. That's what worries me. Is one of the pieces that worries me is the Biden administration. Let's go back to Jake Sullivan. I'll read you his quote about Nord Stream 2, which shows how galactically stupid Sullivan, and he is just way over his head when it comes to his current position. This is his quote when he was speaking to the reporters after the phone call. When it comes to Nord Stream 2, the fact is the gas is not currently flowing through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which means that it's not operating, which means that it's not leveraged for Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's leveraged for the West. If Vladimir Putin wants to see gas flow through that pipeline, he may not want to take the risk of invading Ukraine. In other words, let me just sum it up. Vladimir Putin better not invade Ukraine or else Europe will freeze.
Exactly. I mean, you put it perfectly. I mean, the problem with people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken is that they're imbeciles who think they're geniuses. They think they're being very clever when they make these points. But when you unpack them, they are utterly absurd. I understand that even the Greens in Germany are now grudgingly coming round to the view that Nord Stream 2 is necessary because the situation in Europe with energy supplies is now so incredibly dire. So, Sullivan comes up with these clever ideas. And all I can say is, I hope people in Europe are listening, because his clever idea is that you spite Putin by freezing Europe. I mean, it's just bonkers. Now, can I just say again what I have repeatedly said about Nord Stream 2? Nord Stream 2 was a German project. It's the Germans who asked for it. The Russians were extremely reluctant to do it, and they were eventually talked round into doing it, very much against their own better judgment, if you like. The idea that the Russians would sacrifice their essential security interests for the sake of a pipeline they hadn't wanted in the first place is absurd. It shows, as you correctly say, how completely out of touch the Americans are, or at least Sullivan and people like him are.
Yeah. Well, there was one good commentary to wrap up the video, one good commentary on everything that went down yesterday between Biden and Putin, and that was from Tucker Carlson tonight, and he had retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who is very good when it comes to geopolitics, a very sane and rational man. And towards the end of that segment, this is what he said. He said, and I'm reading this from the Fox News website, so the transcript is, Fox News is adding a lot of their own content in here, but let me just read you what he said. This is the last part of their discussion. "We have one interest, Tucker, to prevent a war from breaking out between Ukraine and Russia." Macgregor added that neocons appear to be on a revenge mission against a country they essentially still view as the enemy USSR, which dissolved on Christmas Day 1991 when the Soviet flag was last lowered from the Kremlin. Macgregor said that Russia is now essentially reverted to its pre-Soviet construction, quote, "a Russian state that rests on the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. It's back to what it had been for thousands of years. We should celebrate that, not destroy it," Macgregor said. And just in closing, I saw the segment, Alexander, when Macgregor said that, Tucker Carlson, they just kind of, they were side by side, and so they weren't looking at each other, but Tucker Carlson said perhaps we should celebrate it. Perhaps that's the reason why they're going after Russia, because of the Orthodox Christianity, this visceral hate. I'm paraphrasing once again. And Macgregor said, perhaps.
We're bent on some sort of revenge mission, which makes no sense, to humiliate and harm Russia. Why is beyond me. This is not the Soviet Union. This is Russia, a Russian state that rests on the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. It's back to what it has been for 1,000 years. We should celebrate that, not try to destroy it.
Maybe that's one of the reasons we are trying to destroy it.
Could be.
Could be. Douglas Macgregor, a wise man. Wish you're in charge.
I thought that was probably one of the best observations as to why there's such a deep, deep down hatred for
Absolutely.
Russia. Anyway, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. For Russia. Well, absolutely. I mean, you have, on the one side, from Macgregor and Carlson, sanity, reason, and reasoned analysis. And who in their senses wants a war in Europe? Who in their senses wants a nuclear war, like that deranged senator was talking about? I mean, this is anger and hate out of control, completely out of control. So on the one hand, you have sanity and reason, and on the other hand, you have people who are so angry and so hate-filled that they're, as I said, prepared to bring down the temple on all our heads in order to achieve whatever deranged objective we have. Now, the big question is, are we in, and it is in Washington, because, I mean, this is a point which I think I want to emphasize to our viewers. If you go to Russia, you do not find that same kind of anger and hate towards us that you see expressed from people like Nuland and the senator towards them. Are we able to restrain these people? They already have far too much power already. They've done far too much damage already. These sort of comments show how dangerous they've become. And I'm going to say straightforwardly, if it comes to Nuland, I think she is the central figure who has created this crisis. She went to Moscow a few weeks ago. She had a very rough time there. The Russians didn't even wanted to come at all. They had to be very strongly persuaded to even allow her into the country. But when she went there, she apparently left extremely angry. She's been spreading stories to the media. I'm sure it's her and her acolytes in the State Department about Russian build-ups, about Russian wars, and she's been trying to crank up all of this tension in order to impose these ferocious sanctions, as she imagines, which are going to end up hurting Europe and the West more than they're going to help hurt the Russians themselves. Russia being, of course, a self-sufficient country, Europe being dependent on Russia for its gas. But as we see people like Sullivan say, as far as they're concerned, Europe is just collateral damage. They don't really care about that. Spiting the Russians is more important for them than peace in Europe, prosperity for Europe's people, or indeed prosperity for the people of the United States.
I was going to say the same thing. They don't care about Europe, and they will bring down the temple in order to somehow achieve this fixation of destroying Russia that they have in their heads. They have no problem destroying Europe if they think it'll destroy Russia. Victoria Nuland said it best in 2014, did she not?
Yeah.
F the EU.
Absolutely.
That's all you need to know.
Absolutely. Exactly.
All right. Well,
there we are.
We'll leave it there.
There we are. We'll leave it there. We'll leave it there.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll leave it on Victoria Nuland's famous words from 2014.
Nuland's.
When they were overthrowing the democratically elected government in Ukraine, by the way. All right. The Duran.locals.com and the Duran shop. Use the code GOODDAY. Get 10% off all merchandise. Take care.